there's a case, Dow versus United States in 1915, where Syrian Christians really pushed for their categorization as white. And because of their phenotypical features, because they were white passing, because of their religious identities, were able to leverage kind of this level of privilege to fall within that white category, and really kind of rode off of that for a while before 1965, and allowing for themselves to be within that white narrative. And so something that I think is really interesting, if you actually Google Arabs in US government, it's fascinating because there are a ton of Arabs in US government. It was never a problem until there were brown Arabs in US government, right? Or until there were black Afro-Arabs. And so there is that level of privilege when it comes to religion. And I would also add that Muslims also benefited from this white categorization as well. So in 1944, it was the first time that whiteness was extended to Arab Muslims. And this was because actually a Saudi student tried to gain citizenship during a time when Arabs were not granted citizenship, or brown folks, brown and black people were not granted citizenship as immigrants. And it was a little bit different. It wasn't a phenotypical, it wasn't a religious identification, but rather it was a US geopolitical kind of desire to align themselves with Saudi Arabia that drove that. But we see for a long time after that, a lot of Arabs who are either white passing or who don't want to kind of align themselves with liberation movements or different forms of resistance, really buying into that white narrative, right? And allowing themselves to sit in that comfort of whiteness, until we see, like very recently with, the ethnic oppression that Arabs have faced after 9/11, the religious oppression that Arab Muslims have faced after 9/11, Arabs who are non-Black, right? Then you see this kind of desire to want to be identified with groups that have not experienced this privilege, right? Because we have been hit with our own oppression as a result of these various forms of oppression. So we see in 1997, and this is a different case, right? Because this is a Black Egyptian, an Afro-Egyptian, who actually sues the state of New Jersey, and there are cases before then too, sues the state of New Jersey to be classified as Black. And you see a lot of Afro-Arabs, Afro-Egyptians, Afro-North Africans, Afro-Arabs across the board, because we know there are Black people across every single one of these countries, really struggle with, how am I being forced to identify as white when I am Black, right? When my experience in this country is Black. You also see this movement, right? And people have heard of it, check it right, you ain't white, with the census and how resources is distributed. Arab American Institute kind of led on that. But what the struggle with this is there wasn't real nuance, right? In understanding that there are categorization within racial identity. So like you see, for example, Latinx community identify as Afro-Latinx or white Latinx, right? Or mixed race or brown. That language wasn't really applied into Arab identity in the same way through organizing and through mainstream rhetoric. Historically, the work of, there has been alignment in organizing, and I just want to uplift something. So it's not like we were just, like, all right, we're going to be white and that's it. Like, we don't want anything to do there. I want to acknowledge that there has been organizing that has happened, right, within the Arab American community. And I'm just going to uplift some of these examples. There are much more in addition to these, but just to lift the case of Nagi Daifallah, which is super important because he was someone who was killed at the hands of police during the time of the farm workers movement. He was a Yemeni farm worker, and his death and his murder actually galvanized a momentum of Yemeni farm workers. And this beautiful image of Yemeni farm workers with the photo of Nasser. I don't know how folks feel about Nasser. I know it's tricky, but just like, showing rooting their Arab identity in this resistance movement in that moment. That was a multiracial movement of farm workers, right, that they aligned themselves with. We also know that there's a lot of global solidarity on issues, right? We see exchanges like when Black Lives Matter delegation visited Palestine a couple years back, and recognized, the importance of the understanding that our oppressions are inherently linked. The prison industrial complex is global. The military industrial complex is global, with US police officers being trained in Israel, right? And so these are things that are important to lift as well. And then I think, just to be really real, what do micro engagements look like, right? With community level engagement, where we see local Arabs, and an example, right? Local Arabs owning hundreds of gas stations and liquor stores, for example, in an area like Detroit. They're serving a mostly Black customer base, where there's a power dynamic that they're exerting over Black community. they're coming in with preconceived notions that they've taken from their homelands, right, that are rooted in anti-Blackness, but also learned anti-Blackness in the United States. And that perpetuates what we see, unfortunately, in the case of George Floyd with his murder with the Arab store owner.